today in our boasted modern civilization, we are facing just exactly the same problems, just exactly the same conflict between two schools of philosophy that they faced in the earliest days of America.
In modern times, colloquial terms such as white, black, Hispanic, Asian, and so on are how we categorize ourselves. This is not based in any meaningful difference, but rather simply the color of one's skin, inherited by one's parents. Skin tone is a polygenic trait with polygenic inheritance, meaning it has multiple contributing factors. These factors are simply a reflection on how much sunlight your collective ancestry was subject to. But truth be told, that's all the science that we're going to be discussing today, as the issue we're concerned with is strictly cultural. To start off, let's first look at a brief history of race, then specifically see where, quote, whiteness comes from. Originally used as a categorizing tool in the English language, race was first conceived in the late 16th century. However, until later in the 18th century, it was strictly used as a synonym to some type, sort, or kind, meaning it was used as a grouping method. Then in the 17th century, the term took a darker turn. English began referencing the Irish as, quote, savages, placing them as a separate race to their supposedly more civilized way of life in England. However, as capitalism has a tendency to do, a lack of labor resources quickly arose in the Western empires. As expansion to the New World was becoming popular, colonists discovered that they simply had a lack of good quality help to fuel their cash crop empires. And this is really where the idea of race took off. Now the global economy was built around slavery. Primarily West African men and women were either stolen from or bartered away from their homes to serve for life for free as farm laborers or other various occupations. Again, being paid no wages and treated inhumanely all the while. This is a massive simplification of the horror of slavery, but establishes why race came to prominence in the first place. This categorization, the invention of these social classes, was for the purpose of subjugation. Establishing themselves as a separate, quote, race was a psychological weapon inflicted upon the enslaved and colonized to break their will and ability to organize and fight back. This is fundamental to the understanding of how neocolonialism and the ideas of race and whiteness continue to inflict the world today. Yet, because of the economy moving forward and the world modernizing to continue the horrid practice of slavery from falling as well as their own wealth, colonists had to further distort reality and separate populations. For this, they took inspiration from a 1613 play by Thomas Middleton. First performed on October 29th, in The Triumphs of Truth, Middleton wrote, quote, I see amazement upon the faces of these white people, wondering and strange-gazed. This is from the perspective of an African king looking and speaking to an European audience. And then, truth be told, to me, this beginning seems extraordinarily random for something so culturally ingrained into the West. But it proves that even at the conception, race was not a scientific fact, but rather simply an individual's idea, and a horridly bad one at that. This grouping of cultures may seem normal, as it is such a Western philosophy, but let's ask a few questions that may just open up your perspective. First, why group all Europeans as quote-unquote white? Up until the 21st century, Western nations have nearly always been at odds with one another. So this is certainly not a grouping of former allies or brothers. Second, who stands to gain from this more generalized grouping strategy? That one you may be able to answer on your own. Whiteness was far more unifying than British or French. By claiming themselves as white, it culturally gave the impression that they were on the same team. It was built this way to provide a more intimidating front to any slave revolts or resistance. And this isn't exactly my perspective. Historian Neil Painter pointed out, quote, "Race is an idea, not a fact." With all this being said, it's impossible to tackle this issue in 2021 without acknowledging the modern context and ramifications. In 1996's Things of Darkness, Kim Hall establishes how whiteness is only still relevant in the context of blackness, establishing that whiteness, quote, "truly only exists when posed next to blackness," unquote. See, this is the crux of the argument. Historical origins are important, but how is it continuing its effect in 2021? In the United States, we observe practically the best example of this. Blackness, or simply being black, comes from different origins than whiteness. When European slaveholders kidnapped so many from their homes, all their lineage, records, and histories were illegalized and destroyed. So for many modern African Americans, it's sometimes impossible to understand and connect back through your history, as oftentimes it's been completely lost. So being black is family history. It is how so many contextualize themselves within this huge, confusing world. Black, then, is a term of empowerment, allowing many to tangibly place pride in a shared heritage. This is in stark contrast to white, obviously. As we've shown, whiteness is not a term of empowerment, but rather oppression. It's illegitimate because, quote, "white people already have familial and cultural histories, and they aren't about whiteness." Only in stupidity can we categorize French and Swedes as, quote, "white," and Zimbabwean and Egyptians as black. This train of thought simply is a direct extension of slavery. Kim Hall further explains, quote, "Whiteness is not constructed by, but dependent on, an involvement with Africans that is the inevitable product of England's ongoing colonial expansion." In essence, when Europeans describe themselves as being white, they are not making any connection to their Englishness or ancestral religious preference. Historically, both more accepted forms of categorization, I may add, but rather their ancestral place within the old slave trade, meaning whiteness explains their self-perceived superiority. As earlier, it made it easier to justify the selling of humans, and today it continues to justify the exploitation and oppression of those same peoples within the West's so-called, quote, "liberal democracy." So, in conclusion, yes, quote, "whiteness is fake." It barely means anything at all in complete contextualization. I mean, really, understanding the entirety of where it comes from, it still makes very little sense. Hopefully this realization will become common knowledge. The only way we can move forward is by breaking down these stupid barriers. And for the future of us all, we better get educated and find solutions.